The Anglo Files, A Field Guide to the British, by Sarah Lyall. Narrated by Cassandra Campbell. Copyright 2008 by Sarah Lyall. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with Sarah Lyall and the Robbins Office, and was produced in the year 2008 by Tantor Media Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. Introduction. Lunch with an Earl. Soon after I moved to London, I was invited through some mutual friends to have lunch with an Earl. A real one, as opposed to someone like James Earl Jones or my Uncle Earl back home. I looked it up. Earls, it turns out, are better than viscounts, barons, and knights, but worse than marquises or dukes, who themselves are not so good as monarchs. But in a world of title inflation and cheap celebrity, an earl is still an impressive thing to be. The lives of many British aristocrats have been diminished by crippling taxes, exorbitant heating costs, and the inconvenient disappearance of the feudal system. Some old lords are rattling along in indigent splendor in crumbling castles. Many have had to sell off their furniture, their paintings, and even their houses. They still get to keep their titles. But my host was not one of those. He was still rich, and he had made his massive estate work for him, attracting tens of thousands of visitors a year who paid to look around its most prominent feature, a 460-year-old mansion that rose like some unwieldy palace in the middle of the Wiltshire countryside. Its treasures included a room where George III slept before sending his troops off to quell, or at least that was the plan, the American Revolution. A room full of Chippendale bookcases and a portrait of Rembrandt's mother, by Rembrandt himself. Due to the length of the corridors and the swarms of visitors and the army of guides and the labyrinth of rooms with their velvet ropes and their signs telling you, "Do not touch," and "This way, please," it was hard to locate the inhabitants of the house, our hosts. But we finally found them. The Earl and the Countess and their small aristocratic children, reading the daily papers like any other family in an exquisite room the length of a football field, every inch of whose walls were adorned with ancestral portraits by such artists as the 17th century court painter Anthony Van Dyck. We were going on a picnic. I thought wicker baskets, smoked salmon, asparagus, strawberries, a babbling brook, weeping willows. I thought of the picnic scene in The Wind in the Willows. But then we went out back, and I saw the car. An ancient jeep that was now a skeletal husk of its former self. It threatened to fall apart as we climbed aboard and folded ourselves into what was left of the seats. Doors were missing. Hooks swung from the ceiling, festooned with scraps of animal carcasses and deceased bird byproducts matted with dried blood. Wellington boots jostled for floor space with decrepit gardening implements. Insect carapaces, muddy, torn Country Pursuits magazines, and broken-off sections of farm machines. It smelled really bad, a noxious mixture of dead things, stale things, and oil. The Earl was driving. The Countess piloted a second equally clapped-out vehicle of indeterminate vintage. We jolted and lurched past hills covered with wild flowers, rolling meadows, and vast fields of crops. It soon became clear that the Earl owned all of it. Not just this part here, but the part straight on to the horizon in all directions, too. Literally everywhere the eye could see, 14,000 acres in all. It was that rare thing, a beautiful spring afternoon. The sun was shining, and we were bathed in warmth. The jeep stopped, which was good, because I was pregnant and queasy from all the buffeting. With a world of lovely places to choose from, our host had selected as his preferred picnic spot a decrepit, semi-burned-down barn with most of one of the walls missing. The temperature seemed to fall 30 degrees, following the unwritten law that says on warm days old buildings in Britain are always freezing. We sat on bales of hay, skirting the bird droppings, and listened to the Earl discuss his latest quixotic scheme, investing in obscure British films, few of which had yet to make it to the cinema. I helped unpack the food. Hot canned cream of tomato soup in a thermos, poured into styrofoam cups. Make your own sandwiches of processed supermarket ham on white, Wonder-style bread. A bottle of orange-flavored sugar water, known as orange squash for the children. And some very nice wine for the grown-ups, which immediately rendered the food a non-issue, except for those of us who were not supposed to drink. What did I learn about my newly adopted country? That assumptions were made to be unmade. That true aristocrats are perhaps the only people in Britain secure enough not to care how others view what they drive, wear, or eat. That some aspects of British life would likely remain forever beyond the grasp of my feeble colonial understanding. And that when invited to a picnic in the country, you should bring an extra sweater, and possibly also some extra food. I had heard it a million times. Britain and America are two nations separated by a common language. But anyone who doubts the truth of it should have been in Boston, Massachusetts a few years ago when my extremely English husband, Robert, tried to rent a car. He telephoned Avis. "Hello," he said, sounding like Hugh Grant in 4 Weddings and a Funeral. "I'd like to hire a car." "Huh?" said the Avis operator. "I'd like to hire a car." "What?" she repeated. Robert immediately adopted a Prince Philip addressing the peasants approach, which meant that he enunciated with exaggerated slowness and increasing volume, as if the operator were feeble or deaf rather than just American. Eventually, he got her to understand that he had said hire, and that hire did not mean employ, but rent. And we got our car. Our vacation was saved. But multiply this little exchange by 1,000,000, imagine me as the ignorant peasant surrounded by people like my husband, and you will have an idea of what my early days in London were like. I moved for love. In the early 1990s, I got a job covering the publishing industry for the New York Times, a big change from my earlier assignments at the paper, when I covered things like Long Island. Major themes: garbage, traffic, and taxes, and state government. Major theme: health insurance. The publishing beat meant that instead of eating my meals in a subterranean Albany cafeteria and spending the evenings listening to legislators bicker about the mysterious formulas used to determine the size of New York City's mass transit subsidy, I got to swank around at fancy Park Avenue publishing parties and talk to famous authors. I also got to take editors out to lunch at expensive restaurants and go to the Frankfurt Book Fair, the world's largest and most exciting banquet of books, held annually in Frankfurt, Germany. Tall, boyish, and answering to the exotic name of Robert McCrum, my future husband appeared on the first night of my first trip to the fair, at a dinner given by Morgan Entrekin, a New York publisher and book fair bon vivant. Robert was a friend of Morgan's. I had been invited along in case I wanted to write an article about what Morgan got up to in Frankfurt, as Times publishing reporters generally do. Robert was like something out of Brideshead Revisited, or at least that's what I thought, not knowing very many British people, and not yet having read a lot of Evelyn Waugh. I could barely understand half of what he said, but I was hooked by his charismatic arrogance, glinting brown eyes, and expert way around the English language. For his part, he liked my raw New World enthusiasm and the fact that I was credulous enough to believe pretty much anything he told me about the UK. We commuted between London and New York for a year, exchanging torrid, illegible letters. This was just before email, and spending hours on the phone laughing delightedly at each other's accents and quaint world views. When it came time for one of us to move so that we could live in the same place, we decided that it would be me. I had only one friend in London, my old college roommate Lily, who had also married an English person. And the transition was much harder than I expected. Sometimes the gloomy weather made me feel gloomy. Sometimes it seemed as if nobody believed I was even speaking English, so it was hard to make them comprehend what I was trying to say. And sometimes, despite my desire to keep an open mind and look past the stereotypes, I ran smack up against a wall of cliches that annoyingly turned out to be true. British people really are more reserved and repressed than Americans. They really do say, sorry, all the time, even when it's not their fault, such as when they trip and fall down or when someone knocks into them on the street. They actually do admire the fact that they have no written constitution. And yes, they believe that baked beans are a vegetable, that the loathsomeness of the French is exceeded only by the loathsomeness of the Germans, and that it is better to shiver in the dark than to swelter in the light. Other things came as a shock and made the transition harder, because I was so ill-prepared. Even in the 21st century, for instance, many British people still ride the subway during the evening rush hour without benefit of deodorant. Their nursery rhyme spider is eensy weensy, not itsy bitsy. When they sneeze, they say achoo, not achoo. They have something called salad cream, a squirtable mayonnaise product that can be slathered on their food to obscure its unpalatability. When they do the dishes, they appear to believe that the part where you're supposed to rinse off the soap is optional. Also, they are not as impressed by Americans as they might be, which was a bit of a blow. I arrived in the mid-1990s, just as 18 years of Conservative Party rule were starting to crumble away. Out of the ruins emerged a new Labour government and a new Prime Minister, Tony Blair, whose youth, idealism, and energy promised to sweep aside the tired platitudes of yesterday for a better tomorrow. At home, my husband fell spectacularly ill, and as he recovered, we had a baby. And then another one. The country felt reborn too, poised for something better, even if no one knew exactly what. It's been an eventful time, and I have spent much of it trying to adjust to, or at least get the measure of, the customs and peccadilloes of my adopted country. Because of my reporting job, I've been allowed to be professionally nosy in a place where the truth beneath the surface is not always readily apparent. Britain is an impossible subject, as impossible to grasp as quicksilver, and God knows people have tried. Things here are so coded, so unstraightforward, so opaque, so easy to misinterpret. At the same time, my experience has naturally been subjective. You can't help observing through the prism of your own culture, interests, and environment. I live in London and work for a newspaper. This would be a different book if I lived in Skegness and worked in a pub. I have found Britons everywhere to be a touchy group, especially when outsiders try to pin them down. But, as I explain to interviewees who become defensive and say, "Well, it's hardly better in America, is it?" It's not a competition. The two countries are just different from each other. Really different. Opposites in some ways. We look to the future, they look to the past. We run for election, they stand for it. We noisily and proudly proclaim our Americanness. They shuffle their feet and apologize for their Britishness. We trumpet our successes, they brag about their failures. When they say they are pleased to meet you, they often mean nothing of the kind. Unlike Americans, they do not want to tell you their life story minutes after making your acquaintance. It takes some time to get that far, but if you do, it means you're friends for life. I came at a singular period of change, one of those great transitional eras in the life of a country. Some of Britain's most ancient institutions, like the House of Lords and the monarchy itself, suddenly seemed up for grabs. So did the old mindset of low expectation and downtrodden self-denial. Money poured in, and London went from being an almost provincial town to a truly international city awash in riches. There was more greed, more emotion, more hurrying, more selfishness, less deference. But underneath it all, it seemed to me, the British character remained essentially the same. When I first moved here and had a certain amount of free time to devote to cultural studies of my new home, I took a deep breath and set about reading Clarissa, Samuel Richardson's classic 18th century novel about a virtuous young girl whose seduction and ruin lead her inevitably to death. From an anthropological point of view, what is interesting about Clarissa is not that it is more than 1,000,000 words long, and that reading it without skipping the dull bits demands a particularly British-style stoicism and patience, but also that it is an epistolary novel, written in the form of letters between its characters. It is a quaint custom, all that letter writing, and at first I assumed it was peculiar to the British gentry from centuries past. In Richardson's time, educated Britons regularly sent letters in the morning, received replies at lunchtime, and responded again in the afternoon. But it was not as unusual as I thought. Ever since we moved into our house in West London, my husband and I have carried on a purely epistolary relationship with our neighbors, an older couple, the husband of which was knighted by the Queen, which means you are meant to call them Sir and Lady. But we never have an occasion to call them anything. These are people with whom we share a wall and a bit of sidewalk, and with whom, in all this time, we have had fewer than a dozen conversations. Even saying good morning, which I did once or twice in the 1990s, seems like an act of aggression, a violation of their zone of privacy. But we write to each other all the time. We are intimate pen pals. When we moved in, we got a letter welcoming us to the neighborhood. When we wrote to notify them of some work we planned to do on the house, they sent a note back inquiring about the common drywall and the potentially creeping damp, subjects that haunt the imaginations of British homeowners. Every year, we get a letter asking us to contribute a bottle of alcohol to the annual church bazaar. Every year, even now, the letters begin, Dear Mr. and Mrs. McCrum. I haven't been here long enough to unravel the layers of meaning in all this. Clearly, they don't want to talk to us. But their reserve can't simply be xenophobia, because my husband's respectable pedigree ought to mitigate the dubiousness of my own. Maybe it's one of those things that's a mixture of rudeness and politeness, discourtesy disguised discourtesy, or vice versa, that the British do so well. It could also be a way to maintain a relationship without the mess and bother of distressing face-to-face intimacy, or simply a reflection of a formality and adherence to convention that still manifest themselves at odd times in social situations. I have constantly been surprised, for instance, at the way it is considered rude at a party to introduce yourself to someone you don't know. The rule is, you're supposed to wait to be formally introduced, preferably by your host. I am useless at making introductions, since names tend to fly out of my brain when I am confronted with more than 2 people at a time. But the old American standby, where you take your 2 friends whose names you can't remember and say, Do you 2 know each other? And wait for them to chime in helpfully, simply doesn't work here. Do you 2 know each other? I'll ask. No, they'll say, followed by silence. I tried a little experiment with my British friend Stephen. We were at a cocktail party, and another guest, a college professor, was coming down the stairs. I briefed Stephen on what an American might say. Hi, I'm Stephen Bailey, Stephen said forthrightly, sticking his hand out. What do you do? The professor looked defensive, stricken almost. You could see him searching for the angle. Is that supposed to be some sort of a joke? He said. I have now lived in Britain for more than a decade. I have 2 daughters who, despite the New World blood in their veins, think that the American Revolution was called the War of American Independence, and that it had to do with British domestic politics rather than the legitimate grievances of the oppressed. I tend to write more letters than I used to. I try to be less boisterous and not wave my arms around so much. I have worked hard to adjust to the puzzling way things can seem the same but be slightly off. The Hoover instead of the vacuum cleaner. The bin liners instead of the garbage bags. The aluminium with an extra I foil. The football that means soccer. I have tried not to be one of those tedious foreigners who cleaves to other expatriates, whining and reminiscing about back home, forcing unbearable traditional food like dumpling stew, or, if you are American, Lucky Charms and boiled red hot dogs on your mortified, eye-rolling children. Of course, I am still noticeably American. I have an exaggerated can-do spirit and a tendency to alarm the natives by suggesting that psychotherapy might help. I dislike Marmite, Cornish pasties, unheated houses, and drinking outside pubs in the rain, and I don't see the point of Mr. Bean and his silly movies. I have clung to my native accent, as a shipwrecked sailor might clutch at a piece of driftwood in the ocean. But I have definitely begun to change. It's a matter of self-preservation, but also a matter of coming to love, and perhaps almost to understand, my adopted country. Not that I'd ever be so American and emotional as to put it that way in public. In the spirit of David Letterman, here are the top 10 signs that I am beginning to adjust to life in Britain. 10. I greet people by kissing them twice, once on each cheek, and asking, "How was your journey?" 9. I care whether the English soccer team wins the World Cup. Not that it ever does. And sometimes, if I am concentrating, I can explain the offside rule. 8. I recognize that Dick Van Dyke's fake Cockney accent in Mary Poppins was a travesty and a disgrace. 7. I am no longer afraid that if I cross the street, a car will suddenly emerge from the wrong direction at 100 miles per hour and mow me down. 6. I recoil when people in social situations ask direct questions about one's salary or the price of one's home. 5. I sometimes use the word one as a first-person singular. 4. I often call dish towels tea towels, and math maths, and I once wrote an article in which I used the phrase, to scupper an agreement, scupper being the British equivalent of scuttle, having forgotten what people say back home. 3. I cushion my statements with qualifications, disclaimers, apologies, unnecessarily modifying adverbs, and backhanded ironic remarks. I am quite upset, slightly depressed, a little unhappy. I think that Hitler was not exactly the nicest person in the world. When I dislocated my shoulder and lay in a heap at the bottom of a flight of stairs at the hairdresser, with hair-dyeing foil all over my hair, feeling pain that was worse than anything I have ever felt before, not even when I had the children, my overwhelming emotion was embarrassment. I said, "Sorry," in a meek little voice. Then, "I think I'm in a bit of pain," and "I might possibly at some point need an ambulance." 2. I realized that history did not start in the year 1492. 1. No matter what happens, I come home, the telephone rings, there is a lull in the conversation, nuclear war is declared, I put the kettle on and start making tea. Still, do I ever eat baked beans for breakfast, believe that it is okay to leave the suds on the clean dishes, or announce my intention to hire a car? No, but give me time. Chapter 1. Naughty Boys and Rumpy-Pumpy. Jonathan Cowop. If someone is described as hirsute, what are they? Contestant. Cowop. Here's a clue. Most men are, and most women would like us to think they are not. Contestant, after long pause. Is it gay, Jonathan? Exchange on BBC Radio York, quoted in Private Eye. Just as some women are inexplicably attracted to prison inmates, so others yearn above all for Englishmen, with their thrilling accents, rumpled boyish hair, and ability to make even pointless banalities sound like brilliant repartee. Find one of those, you think, and you will never be lost for conversation. Madonna so keen on the genre that she successfully acquired first a strangulated faux English accent, and then a real-life English husband, is perhaps the most prominent contemporary example, but there are others. Gwyneth Paltrow married an Englishman. So did Wallis Simpson, and look what happened to her. I have a personal interest in this issue, of course, on account of the fascinating domestic specimen currently at work at home upstairs in his study, which could be the sunniest room in the house, except that he keeps the curtains pulled shut even in summer, toiling away like Bob Cratchit by the weak light of a small desk lamp. But never mind that now. The point is that while Englishmen present an impeccable facade, capable, articulate, charming, and best of all, ripe for emotional awakening at the deft hands of a clever foreigner, underneath things are much more complicated than they appear. There are many reasons, I believe, but we might as well start with their sex education. When I was in 6th grade in New York back in the 1970s, our science syllabus included Love and Sex in Plain Language, a paperback bulging with lurid drawings of naked teenagers in the full sprouting bloom of puberty. The lessons themselves were not particularly useful. What is it like to have sex with your husband? I remember a classmate asking our horrified teacher, but at least we got an idea of what we were in for. Relegated to single-sex education or shipped off to unheated boarding schools with no girls for miles, my British male contemporaries, meanwhile, were learning either nothing or information so bizarre as to be permanently crippling. My friend John was informed, along with his classmates, that he would soon find a golden seed in his bed in the mornings. At the age of 12, the writer John Mortimer was told by his headmaster, "You will probably have dreams, and in the morning you will wake up thinking what a rotter you are. My advice is to have a very cold bath or go for a run to get it out of your system." Ben McIntyre, a columnist for the Times of London, said, "My entire sex education consisted of being shown enormous 6-foot pictures of diseased private parts." For my friend Ed, it happened when he was 8 and hunting grouse on the moors with his father, an activity that covered a lot of important father-son ground. They were spending time together. They were engaging in an invigorating outdoor pursuit. They were having a heart-to-heart talk. And, on account of having to pay attention to what they were doing, or else they might shoot the wrong thing, they could look at the birds instead of at each other. "You'll soon be going away," Ed's father remarked, peering at the potential grouses concealed in the brush. He fired a shot. "Boys will want to interfere with you." He fired again. "Don't let them." One of my in-laws had an off-the-syllabus sex lesson on his last day of prep school when he was about 12. The headmaster gathered the departing class in his study and pulled down his pants. He took out his penis. He announced to the assembled boys that when they got older, theirs would grow larger and have hair too. Another relative was sitting innocently in school one day when his teacher said that the time had come to talk of sexual intercourse. Ah, goody, he thought, but the lesson consisted of a 15-minute nature video of 2 racehorses copulating in a field. There were no follow-up questions, and he was filled with emotional anxiety, particularly about the film's relevance to the human experience. Were women similarly standoffish? Was it over that quickly? And was it okay for the man to trot off afterward for lunch and a drink with his friends? It was a long time before I realized that you didn't always have to do it from behind, he said. In his memoir, Stand Before Your God, the novelist Paul Watkins describes late 1970s sex education at Eton, taught by the notorious Dr. Twombly, so creaky, vague, and rackety-looking that at first the boys mistook him for an ancient member of the custodial staff, kept on for sentimental reasons. Until then, Everything Watkins knew about sex he had gleaned from a contraband copy of Big Tits magazine that he concealed inside a New Statesman cover. After successfully arriving at the blackboard, Dr. Twombly drew a diagram of a male stick figure lying atop.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?